But Pablo Rodriguez, the drunk driver, he is the heritage minister. And besides from a gorgeous head of hair, he shares Trudeau and Guilbeault's belief in censoring the enemies of the government. Trouble is, there's not a lot of enemies of the government left in Canada. They've all been corrupted. There's two ways to go after an enemy, I suppose. One is the carrot and one is the stick. And in the case of the stick, Trudeau and his heritage ministers have offered hundreds of millions of dollars in, I don't think there's any problem calling them bribes to news organizations. In fact, we revealed a few months ago that prior to the last federal election, Trudeau made an emergency payment of $61 million to different news media companies on the eve of the election, and none of those companies reported that they took the cash. It took an access to information request to get the names of them. We published the name, dozens and dozens of pages. It's hard to believe, but there are 1,500 news media companies in Canada that took the payoff from Trudeau. I didn't even know there were 1,500 news companies in Canada, but they took the dough. I think Trudeau's brilliant in that way. He doesn't need to nationalize them like the CBC. Have them pretend to be private. Have them pretend to be independent and ask him tough questions, and then just pay them a subsidy on an annual basis. That's important too. Keep them on their best behavior because they know they'll have to make the grant request again and again. Don't let them get out of line. You know, it would have taken billions and billions of dollars to buy up and nationalize these media companies, but renting them is far cheaper, and it continues the illusion of opposition. But you can't really oppose someone who you rely on for money. We know that. That's why ads in a newspaper are marked as ads, so that the reader is aware that someone paid to have you read that. I don't know why we're similarly not marking journalistic reports paid for by Trudeau with that same disclaimer. How can you trust a journalist to report on Trudeau when he's paid by Trudeau? We didn't have an answer to that ever. Well, this has been going on for years, and you can see the effect slowly. You saw it, for example, during the trucker rebellion, when the bulk of the mainstream media took the Trudeau narrative that these were violent domestic extremist terrorists who had to be denounced. And the media party, instead of talking about Trudeau's first ever invocation of the Emergencies Act, agreed with them and were the shrillest voices demanding harsher crackdowns. I've never seen so-called liberal journalists call for police violence before like I did then. But yesterday, Pablo Rodriguez, the drunk driver, announced the next phase of the government regulation of the industry. And again, if this had been done 5 years ago, as a shock, we're going to nationalize and regulate the industry, you would have seen journalists be appalled. But they've been trained and conditioned over the last few years to be obedient clients of the Liberal government. So yesterday, when Pablo Rodriguez had his press conference, he did two things. First of all, he only allowed questions from approved lists of journalists. So any skeptics or critics weren't allowed in. And second of all, I mean, the questions were all technical questions. How will you do this? How will you do that? These were journalists curious about their new workplace rules. It would be like the boss saying, hey, we've got a new staff manual. And staff saying, well, what are the vacation policies? And what's the lunch break policy? They were just asking for technical details. None of them, not one, expressed shock that the government would dare to regulate the news media, would dare to tell them what the rules are and who is or isn't a journalist. We've long passed that moment. These are people who are embracing their role as de facto employees of Ottawa. Here's just one clip from the Q&A just showing, I mean, you've just announced, and I'll get into the details, you've just announced media accreditation done by the government in the country. And these journalists just have technical questions. Now, let me tell you about this new entity, this new acronym that the government has invented. They actually started using this a few years ago. It's alphabet soup like so many government red tape programs. It's called the QCJO, that really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? That stands for Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization. And who qualifies them? Well, in Canada, journalism is not a formal profession like doctors or engineers or accountants are. And you want your doctors and engineers and your pilots to be accredited. You don't want just anyone flying a plane or engaging in surgery. So there really is a qualification, an exam, standards, professional conduct. There is none for journalism. Journalism isn't a profession, it's an activity. It's like saying you're going jogging. What are your credentials? No, there's no credential to going jogging. It's someone who jogs is a jogger, just to come up with an example. Journalism's the same way. There are journalism schools, just the same way there's training camps and, you can get a coach to help you run better. But journalism is someone who just writes down what happens during the day. That's the root of the word. You can see it in French, jour, to journalize on the happenings of the day. There is no profession. You can get as many qualifications as you like if that's important to you, if you think you'll learn something. But anyone who reports is a reporter. Anyone who has an opinion is an opinion writer. That's how it is. In fact, every single one of us is a publisher now since the age of the internet and social media. If you're writing something on your Facebook page, on your LinkedIn page, on your Instagram page, you are a journalist. In fact, quite a lot of stories are broken from people who just happen to have a cell phone in their pocket. In the past, only professionals had video cameras on them. It was a very rare thing. You had to run out to get the news. These days, every single one of us is a news reporter. So what does the drunk driver Pablo Rodriguez mean when he says a QCJO, a Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization? Well, he means qualified with the qualities that Trudeau chooses. In other words, he will make a list of who's qualified or not. A politician will do that. Now, one of the first questions that came up, and you can see what's on their mind, one of the accredited journalists said, what are you going to do if Rebel News applies to be a qualified journalist? Here, take a look at that.
What are the criteria going to be to determine who is and who isn't a news organization, and would say something like Rebel News qualified?
Well, I don't decide who qualified and who doesn't. Of course, that would be terrible in our democracy. It's not up to the minister to say, hey, that's a good idea, this one. No. Not up to the minister or the government to decide who qualifies. There are those criteria that you referred to. Of course, the organizations are already benefit from the QCGO. So they're engaged in the production of original news content. They employ 2 or more journalists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those criteria are defined there.
Gee, we're living rent-free in their head. I'm not sure what journalist that was, but yeah, they all know. They want to keep Rebel News out. It's a perfectly reasonable question because Trudeau is obsessed with banning Rebel News from anything he can. You'll remember in 2019, Trudeau banned Rebel News from sending reporters to the election leadership debates in 2019. We rushed to court. It was an enormous victory. And we asked these questions, which he did not like. Remember these?
Have you, your campaign, or any other agents secured non-disclosure agreements from anyone about inappropriate sexual personal conduct?
No.
Follow-up, the 2001 yearbook from West Point Grey Academy says that you and convicted sex offender Christopher Ingvaldson made a young student's, quote, life at WPGA a lot more interesting / amusing, end quote. How did you two keep her amused?
We were teachers.
Yeah, you can see why he wanted to ban Rebel News, because none of the trained, obedient media would dare ask those questions. And I don't care if you like those questions or not. They were all fair and they were put fairly. And actually, frankly, Trudeau answered all the questions to his credit. That was in 2019 he answered them. You would just never have those kind of questions because you would never ask someone who's giving you an allowance prickly questions like that. It's just contrary to your own survival as journalists. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.